Imagine this: a tiny group of followers in ancient Judea sparks a movement that spreads across the world and changes human history forever. But what if the DNA of those earliest Christians held secrets we're only just discovering? Modern genetic research is now shedding light on the origins of Christianity's first believers. These weren't just isolated groups of people living in a small corner of the Roman Empire. They were part of a complex web of ancient populations, whose genes carried traces of migrations, wars, and centuries of intermingling cultures. For centuries, historians pieced together the story of early Christianity through ancient texts and archaeology. But now, DNA from ancient bones and modern descendants is adding a new layer to that story. It's revealing not just who the first Christians were, but how their genetic legacy shaped the spread of Christianity itself. Early Christians came from diverse backgrounds: Jewish communities in Galilee and Jerusalem, Greek-speaking populations in cities like Antioch, and even Roman soldiers stationed across the empire. These groups mingled, married, and formed communities that transcended ethnic lines. And their DNA still carries the echoes of that diversity. What scientists are uncovering is both surprising and deeply human. It turns out that the earliest followers of Jesus weren't a monolithic group. They were a mosaic of people whose genes carried the fingerprints of ancient migrations and historical events. And as Christianity spread, so did their DNA, weaving their story into the genetic fabric of Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. In this video, we'll break down the fascinating genetic puzzle of the first Christians. We'll explore what ancient DNA reveals about their ancestry, how early Christian communities became melting pots of different cultures, and what surprising connections scientists are still uncovering today. So stick around, because by the end of this video, you might just see the earliest Christians in a whole new light, not just as historical figures, but as living, breathing people whose very cells carried the story of one of the world's most influential movements. Picture ancient Judea, a crossroads of empires, cultures, and people. By the time Jesus walked the earth, this land had already absorbed millennia of migrations and conquests, each leaving a genetic imprint. So, what did the DNA of the first Christians actually look like? Recent genetic studies on ancient remains from the region reveal a fascinating blend of ancestries. The people of 1st century Judea carried genetic markers tied to earlier Canaanite populations, along with traces of Mesopotamian, Persian, and Greek influences. This mix reflects the region's turbulent history, from Babylonian exiles to Alexander the Great's conquests. Each wave of migration shaped the genetic pool. Interestingly, researchers studying ancient Jewish genomes found that while there was a core Levantine genetic signature, there were also subtle but significant influences from surrounding populations. This aligns perfectly with what we know from history. Jews in the Roman period were not isolated. They traded, traveled, and intermarried with neighboring groups, especially in cosmopolitan hubs like Jerusalem and Sepphoris. The first Christians emerged from this genetically diverse environment. Jesus' earliest followers were predominantly Jewish, but as Christianity spread, it quickly attracted Gentiles, non-Jews from Greek, Roman, and even North African backgrounds. DNA evidence suggests that ancient people from these regions already carried blended ancestry, meaning early Christian communities became even more genetically complex. Studies on ancient Greek and Roman remains show genetic links to both Southern Europe and the Near East. This suggests that many of the earliest converts, especially in places like Antioch and Ephesus, may have carried a mix of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern DNA. So when we think of the first Christians, we're not looking at a single type of person, we're looking at a dynamic tapestry of genetic identities. This diversity likely helped Christianity spread. The faith's message of unity across cultural boundaries resonated with people whose very DNA told a story of interconnectedness. And as these early Christians migrated and formed communities, they carried their unique genetic heritage with them, sowing the seeds of what would eventually become a global religion. But this is just the beginning. The genetic legacy of the first Christians didn't just stay in the Levant, it radiated outwards, blending with new populations as Christianity expanded. In the next section, we'll explore how that expansion left permanent genetic footprints across the Roman Empire and beyond. As Christianity spread like wildfire through the Roman Empire, it carried not just ideas but also the DNA of its earliest believers. The faith's expansion wasn't just a spiritual movement, it was a human migration, leaving genetic echoes that scientists are only now beginning to unravel. When apostles like Paul traveled to cities like Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome, they were stepping into diverse populations. The Roman Empire was a melting pot where people from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa coexisted, traded, and intermarried. Genetic studies of ancient remains from these cities show an incredible mixture of ancestries, with individuals carrying markers from regions as far-flung as Britain, Anatolia, and the Levant. Interestingly, genetic analysis of early Christian burial sites in Rome reveals individuals with clear Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, suggesting that some early believers were either immigrants or descendants of people from Judea and surrounding regions. This aligns perfectly with historical records, which show that many Jewish communities in the diaspora were among the first to adopt Christianity. But the genetic story doesn't stop there. As Christianity gained followers across Europe, new genetic lineages merged with those of the original believers. For example, in places like Gaul, modern-day France, and Hispania, Spain, Christian converts were likely descended from local Celtic and Iberian tribes, whose DNA would have blended with that of Levantine and Roman Christians through intermarriage. What's even more fascinating is how this genetic mixing continued as Christianity spread beyond the empire. When missionaries brought the faith to regions like Ethiopia and Armenia, they introduced new layers of genetic diversity. Studies of ancient Ethiopian genomes, for example, show a mix of sub-Saharan African and Middle Eastern ancestry, a testament to the region's long-standing connection to the broader Christian world. This genetic fusion helped Christianity endure. The faith's ability to cross ethnic and cultural lines created communities that reflected the diversity of the world itself. And as Christianity evolved into a global religion, the DNA of its earliest followers became part of the genetic fabric of countless populations. The ancestries, Levantine, Anatolian, and even traces of European DNA. This makes sense, considering the region's role as a crossroads of ancient civilizations. Many of the first Christians were Jews living in this diverse environment, and their descendants carried this genetic mosaic with them as they spread the new faith across the Roman Empire. As Christianity expanded, so did its genetic footprint. Analysis of remains from ancient Roman catacombs, burial sites used by early Christians, shows individuals with genetic markers from North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and even Germanic regions. This aligns perfectly with historical records of the empire's vast diversity, and the early church's appeal to people of all ethnicities and social classes. In regions like Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where Christian communities thrived, ancient DNA studies reveal populations that carried both local Anatolian and Eastern Mediterranean genetic signatures. These genetic traces persisted even after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, blending over centuries with the DNA of neighboring populations. Even more intriguingly, genetic research on isolated Christian populations, like the Assyrians and Maronites, shows a remarkable preservation of ancient Middle Eastern genetic markers. These groups, who maintained their faith and traditions despite centuries of hardship, act almost like living genetic time capsules, offering insights into the biological makeup of the earliest Christians. This genetic legacy also reaches into Europe. For example, studies on modern Italian populations show subtle genetic influences from the Eastern Mediterranean, likely a remnant of ancient Christian migrations. Similarly, populations in Greece and the Balkans exhibit genetic patterns that mirror the historical spread of Christianity through these regions. By connecting these genetic dots, scientists are painting an ever clearer picture of how Christianity spread not just through word and deed, but through the very bloodlines of its believers. And as genetic technology continues to advance, we may uncover even more surprising connections to those ancient communities who helped shape the world's largest religion. The genetic origins of the first Christians are intricately tied to two powerful ancient societies, the Judeans and the Romans. As Christianity emerged in Judea, its earliest followers were mostly Jewish, living within a culturally and genetically complex region. But as the faith spread through the Roman Empire, the genetic pool of these early Christians became even more diverse, reflecting the vast, interconnected world of antiquity. Recent DNA studies on skeletal remains from ancient Judea reveal a rich genetic blend. People living in the region carried ancestry from the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. This makes sense historically. Judea was a melting pot of civilizations, with trade routes and conquests bringing in people from across the ancient world. The earliest Christians, many of whom were Jewish converts, carried this complex genetic heritage with them as they spread the teachings of Jesus. Meanwhile, genetic analysis of Roman remains shows an even broader mixture of ancestries. The Roman Empire spanned 3 continents, and people from North Africa, the Middle East, and Northern Europe all lived and died in Rome itself. Early Christian converts in Rome, many of whom were slaves, merchants, or travelers, carried this diverse genetic tapestry into the growing Christian community. Interestingly, studies of ancient cemeteries tied to early Christian communities show evidence of genetic mixing between people from distant regions. For example, in southern Italy, ancient remains show genetic signatures from the Levant and North Africa, aligning with the historical accounts of early Christian missionaries traveling across the Mediterranean. What's even more fascinating is that this genetic blending wasn't just a side effect of empire, it became part of the Christian story. Christianity's message of universal salvation drew people from all backgrounds, and this inclusivity is reflected in the DNA of its early followers. Today, traces of this ancient genetic intermingling persist. Populations in the eastern Mediterranean, southern Italy, and even parts of North Africa still carry genetic markers that echo the movements and migrations of early Christian communities. It's as if the DNA of those first believers quietly endured through the centuries, carrying the biological legacy of Christianity's earliest days. These genetic links offer a powerful reminder of how interconnected human history truly is. The rise of Christianity wasn't just a cultural shift, it was a biological one, blending diverse peoples into a faith that would reshape the world. As Christianity spread across the ancient world, so did the DNA of its earliest followers. But what if we could trace that spread not just through historical records, but through genetic markers passed down through generations? Modern science is making this possible, revealing hidden connections between ancient Christian populations and their descendants today. One key genetic marker scientists have studied is the presence of certain Y chromosome haplogroups common in the Levant. These haplogroups, especially J1 and J2, are found in high concentrations in regions where Christianity first took root: Judea, Syria, and parts of Anatolia. But what's truly fascinating is how these markers show up across Europe and North Africa, tracing the exact paths early Christian missionaries traveled. For example, genetic studies in Greece, Italy, and Spain show elevated frequencies of Levantine markers, especially in regions with ancient Christian settlements. This suggests that the people who carried Christianity across the Roman Empire didn't just spread their faith, they passed on their DNA as well. In North Africa, Berber populations show traces of Levantine ancestry, likely linked to early Christian communities established before the Islamic expansion. Mitochondrial DNA, passed through the maternal line, also reveals clues. Certain mitochondrial haplogroups tied to the Near East are found in places like southern Italy and the Balkans, matching historical accounts of Christian communities that formed as exiles and converts moved through the empire. These genetic echoes align with historical patterns of persecution, migration, and missionary work. What's even more surprising is that some isolated Christian populations, like the Assyrians and certain groups in Armenia, have retained genetic profiles remarkably similar to ancient Near Eastern populations. It's as if their DNA preserved a snapshot of the genetic landscape of the earliest Christian era, offering scientists a living link to the past. This genetic trail tells a powerful story. Christianity wasn't just an ideological movement, it was a human one. People carried their beliefs across mountains, seas, and continents, and their DNA traveled with them. Today, those genetic markers are like breadcrumbs, guiding scientists back to the origins of a faith that changed the world. Genetics has opened a powerful new window into the past, giving us a deeper understanding of the earliest Christians not just as historical figures, but as real people whose DNA still echoes through time. The strands of their genetic code connect ancient Judean followers to communities across Europe, North Africa, and beyond, mirroring the explosive spread of Christianity itself. What's most striking is how science aligns with history. The genetic links between Levantine populations and early Christian regions confirm the movements of missionaries, exiles, and converts as recorded in ancient texts. DNA evidence doesn't replace historical accounts, it reinforces them, adding another layer of truth to the story of Christianity's rise. But genetics also humanizes that story. When we talk about early Christians, we're not just talking about anonymous historical figures, we're talking about people who lived, loved, and passed their DNA to future generations. Their genetic legacy is a reminder that history isn't just something we read about in books, it's something that lives within us. This research also shows how interconnected humanity truly is. The DNA of early Christians didn't stay locked in the Levant, it spread across continents, blending with local populations and evolving over time. It's a genetic testament to the universality of the Christian message, a faith that transcended borders and united people from vastly different backgrounds. And perhaps that's the most powerful takeaway of all, the story of early Christianity isn't just a religious narrative or a historical curiosity. It's a human epic, written in flesh and blood. By studying the DNA of these ancient believers, scientists aren't just uncovering genetic secrets, they're bringing the voices of the past back to life, reminding us that we are all part of a much larger story.